One of the most important things that affects the theater goer's experience is their background, the knowledge they bring with them when they go to the theatrical event. The writer of our textbook lists 5 separate things, 5 separate types of knowledge that could affect the theater goer's experience. The first of those is a knowledge of the socioeconomic world of the play, or that produced the play. For instance, you're going to see Agamemnon next week. If you have knowledge of the world of the ancient Greek theater, then you will have a deeper understanding of the play. If you understand that women were seen as inferior citizens in the Greek world, then you will understand why Clytemnestra is cast in the way she's cast in the play. If you understand their love of moderation and control, you understand why it is viewed so negatively when Oedipus rashly decides to find out the solution to the mystery that he's faced with in Oedipus the King. So an understanding of the world that produced the play, the historical era, will help you. Now, does that mean that you have to have that to appreciate the play? No, of course. Knowledge will definitely improve the experience, give you a greater understanding and appreciation of the play. The next item that can influence your experience at the theater is a knowledge of the play or the playwright. For instance, Shakespeare, the author of Macbeth, was a playwright during the Elizabethan era, but he also was a writer during the Jacobean era, during the reign of James I. When Elizabeth died, Shakespeare found himself without patronage, and so he was desperately seeking a way to gain the attention and the goodwill of James I. And so he wrote a play that would appeal to James's background, his culture, his own interests. First of all, James I of England had been James VI of Scotland. He was the child of Mary, Queen of Scots, and so when trying to get his attention, Shakespeare writes a play about Scotland, about the country of his birth. It just so happened that 2 of the characters in Macbeth, Banquo, Macbeth's friend who was murdered early in the play, and Fleance, Banquo's son who escapes, were descendants of James I. Additionally, one of the most important themes that we see throughout Macbeth is witchcraft and the 3 witches who advise him that he will be King of Scotland. James I's personal hobby was a study of the occult, and particularly the study and fighting of witchcraft. He wrote a book on how to recognize witches and how to battle them. So you look at the play, it's all an elaborate homage to James I to get his attention, hopefully his goodwill, and eventually his patronage. If you look at a more modern play, say The Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams, which we'll be doing here at Bluefield next semester, The Glass Menagerie is in many ways an autobiographical play about Tennessee Williams' own life. The main character, the male character in Glass Menagerie, is named Tom. Tennessee Williams' real name was Thomas Lanier Williams. His sister, Rose, suffered from mental illness and eventually was lobotomized in her 20s. The sister character in The Glass Menagerie is named Laura, but she's nicknamed Blue Roses because of an illness she had, an illness that left her emotionally scarred. So again, we see this information about the playwright's life influencing how we experience his play. Can you watch Glass Menagerie without that knowledge? Yes. Does understanding that it is in many ways an autobiographical look at Tennessee Williams' own life, does that help? Does it help? Yes, most definitely. The next piece of information or knowledge that can influence your experience of the play is the expectations you take with you when you go. Now, several years ago, when our kids were still at home, our oldest was involved in a high school production of My Fair Lady. And as his parents, Rebecca and I, were committed to going and seeing him in that play. But our expectations of going were that we were going to see probably a pretty bad production. And the play lived up to all our expectations. It was a pretty bad production. It was great to us because our son was in it, but it was not a good artistic effort. It was great for a high school play, but it was not a great play. Now, if I was going to Broadway, which is considered by many to be the pinnacle of American theater, and has ticket prices to match, if I was going to Broadway and had paid $100, $150, $200 for tickets to see the production of My Fair Lady I saw, I would be demanding to see the manager at the end of it, because I would have felt I hadn't got my money's worth. We have expectations. And if you look at our textbook, the author gives us a very complete list in this section on the types of theater you can expect to see in the United States. Broadway, off-Broadway, off-Broadway, regional theaters, dinner theaters, college theaters, community theaters. And so I encourage you to read that. That'll give you an understanding of the kind of theaters that you can attend in our country and the expectations you would have going to those theaters. Now, in many markets or areas where there is a great deal of live theater, there is the theater critic who writes for the local papers or who presents on the local television stations that gives reviews or critiques of plays that are opening in the area. And so it's important to consider for a little bit the background, the input that the critic can have in your theater experience. There are two types of criticism that we deal with in the theater. There is descriptive criticism, and that's criticism that tells what happened in a play and whether we would like it or enjoy it, a critique. But then there is prescriptive criticism. Prescriptive criticism not only tells us what happened in the play, but tells us what could have been done to improve the play, what would have made it better. Now, when we talk about a critic, any kind of good critic should answer three questions. And these questions come from the 18th century literary critic Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. But von Goethe says that there are three questions a critic needs to ask as he evaluates a work of art. First of all, what was the artist trying to accomplish? Second, how well did the artist accomplish it? And finally, was it worth the attempt in the first place? And so those three questions should be the basis of any criticism. Now, obviously, living in Southwest Virginia, we don't have a lot of live theater, and therefore we don't have a lot of theater critics. We don't have people writing reviews of plays. But when you live in an area that does have live theater, you will have frequently the input of that critic. And it's important to ask, are they giving you well-balanced, evaluative criticism? Are they answering the three questions that Goethe lists? The last part of the audience's background that we want to look at tonight is your own personal history. There are things that have occurred in your life. There are things that are part of your psyche and your makeup that make your experience in a theater and in the theatrical event different from any other person who will be viewing that play. Rebecca and I were watching a movie once called Smoke Signals. It's an independent film, but about two young Native Americans. And one of the principal character in the movie is on a quest to find his father. As frequently happens in the Native American world, the father has been an alcoholic and has left his son behind, and so his son has gone to find him and find out what led the father to that decision. And as we were watching the movie, I was enjoying it, but it wasn't really touching me. And then I hear crying, and I look over, and Rebecca is sobbing. And I finally understood she was having a different experience. Rebecca was the child of an alcoholic father, and so many of the things that she saw depicted in that film were hitting her in a much different way than they were affecting me. And so it's important to understand that this is something that is part of us. We carry it with us everywhere we go. It is inescapable. It's what makes us who we are.